The room does not smell like food. It smells like ink. Faint. Unmistakable. Entirely wrong for a dining room sealed beneath a Korean restaurant in Lagos, set for 12 men who have not come here to eat. The table is precise. The candles have already been extinguished. The stillness in the room is not the stillness of men who are at ease. It is the stillness of men who have spent years training their bodies to stay quiet when something consequential is about to occur. That is exactly what she needs. He enters last. And then, as he does every year on this night, his gaze moves to the scroll. His father's scroll. 30 years on that wall. 30 years of deference, legitimacy, and authority, built on those characters, consecrated by that red painted seal. He has never questioned it. He has never had a reason to. It is about a name. A name that was written, and then erased. By someone who believed that what a dying man could not see could not hurt him. That someone was wrong. The question is not what the scroll says. The question is whose hands actually wrote it, and what it costs a dynasty built on half a name when the other half finally walks into the room. Before we go any deeper, drop your city, state, or country in the comments right now. Because this story begins in Lagos, but the secret that started all of it was made in a calligrapher's room in Seoul, 30 years before tonight. The building above is a restaurant. Clean signage. Warm lighting. The kind of place where a reservation takes 3 weeks and the menu is recited, never printed. Below it is something else entirely. A sealed lower level, accessible only through a door at the back of the kitchen that does not appear on any building schematic filed with the Lagos Planning Authority. One entrance. No windows. 2 men standing outside the door who are not employed by the restaurant and are not paid to speak. This is the only location outside Seoul where the Joseon dynasty conducts its formal business. The room exists in one city. It answers to another. Inside, phones were collected at the door. Not requested. Collected. By a man who did not make eye contact and did not return them until the same man who took them decided the evening was finished. No recording devices. No exceptions. The rule was not posted anywhere. It did not need to be. The men who sat in this room already understood it, the way they understood everything about being here, through the accumulated knowledge that the cost of forgetting was not a warning. It was a consequence. The room held 12 seats. Every seat was filled. Every man had been in this room before. Not one of them had ever arrived late. Not once. Not for any reason. Tonight was not an ordinary meeting. Tonight was the anniversary. Every year, on the same date, the date John Mun-ho drew his final breath, these 12 men gathered in this room beneath his scroll to perform the same ceremony he had instituted before anyone at that table was old enough to have earned their place in it. The scroll had hung on that wall for 30 years. The ceremony had been conducted 30 times. The dynasty had never once questioned either. That was, in many ways, the point. A thing that is never questioned functions as truth. Whether or not it is one. The table communicated everything the room would never say aloud. The men closest to the head sat closest to power. The men at the far end understood, without instruction, that they were present to witness, not to decide. Between those two positions, every seat told a precise story about loyalty rewarded, debts carried, and relationships that existed only because someone had once demonstrated they could keep a secret for a very long time. There were no name placards. There had never been name placards. Each man walked into the room and found his seat by instinct. The hierarchy was old enough and real enough to be felt rather than read. That was how dynasties maintained themselves. Not through force. Through furniture. Park Dae-young sat immediately to Kwon Seo's right. He was not the youngest man in the room, nor the most imposing, nor the one who commanded the most direct operational authority over the dynasty's business. He was something more valuable than all of that. He was the man who remembered everything. Who had been present for decisions that no living person outside this room could verify. who had served John Mun Ho before Quan Seo was born and continued serving the name after Mun Ho's death, as though the transition between those two eras had required nothing more than the turning of a single page. His seat to the right was not ceremonial. It was structural. It was the seat of a man who knew where the foundations were buried, because he had helped lay them. The ceremony began the way it always began, without announcement. Quan Seo looked at the scroll. The room understood that as a signal. One by one, beginning to his left and moving around the table, each man recited a single line from the scroll's text. A ritual of lineage. A spoken acknowledgement that they sat in this room because of what was written on that wall, and not the other way around. The recitation moved slowly. Deliberately. Each man selected his line with the care of someone choosing an oath. Which was precisely what it was. No one rushed. No one deviated. No one had deviated in 30 years. Adiz moved through all of it without disturbing any of it. In 11 months of working ceremony nights in this room, she had learned how to make herself functionally absent. How to refill a glass at the precise moment a man's attention was directed elsewhere. How to remove a dish before it registered as a distraction. How to occupy a space in a way that made her invisible, not because she lacked presence, but because she had learned precisely where to place it so that no one in the room was currently looking. She had been carefully taught to be invisible in this specific room for a very specific reason. Tonight was the night that preparation ended. It was a younger lieutenant, seated near the far end of the table, who mispronounced the character. A single syllable. A minor inflection error that several men in the room may not have detected. Quan Seo caught it without lifting his eyes from the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up. He simply spoke the correct pronunciation, once, cleanly, with the precision of a man who had known every character of that scroll since before he fully understood what they meant, and the recitation continued as though the interruption had not occurred. The lieutenant did not speak again for the remainder of the ceremony. Neither did anyone else unnecessarily. When the recitation completed its circuit, Quan Seo stood. This portion of the evening belonged only to him. No script. No assigned line. An unwritten address to the scroll, to his father, to the founding, delivered in the same room, on the same night, every year, with no written word to guide it. He had given this address 22 times since assuming leadership of the dynasty. Each time, the room listened with the quality of silence that is indistinguishable from held breath. She set her tray down. The movement was quiet. Unhurried. The entirely natural behavior of a server clearing space while a speaker addressed the room. Several men registered it subconsciously and found nothing worth noting. Her hand moved to the brush. She lifted it. The grip was not the grip of someone handling an unfamiliar object. It was the grip of someone who had held a brush many times before, under instruction, with intention, toward a purpose. Thumb angled correctly. Wrist settled without thought. The brush balanced in her hand as though it recognized her. She did not look at the room when she picked it up. She looked at the scroll. Specifically at the seal. Specifically at one character within the seal that she had been looking at, in photographs and in memory, for considerably longer than 11 months. 3 seconds passed before anyone reacted. That gap, 3 full seconds in a room full of men trained to respond to disruption, said something important about what they were witnessing. The mind, when confronted with something it has no category for, takes longer than it should. None of the 12 men at that table had a category for what they were seeing. The nearest guard moved first. A broad man stationed near the door, hand already moving, crossing the room with the controlled urgency of someone whose entire professional value lived in the space between incident and consequence. He was not going to reach her in time. She had already calculated that. She raised the brush. Not to the scroll, she did not touch the scroll. She raised it to the air beside the founding seal and, with one deliberate stroke, traced a single character. A correction. Specific, technically precise, drawn in empty space with the calm authority of someone who had rehearsed that movement until it required no thought whatsoever. Then she lowered the brush. And said nothing. The guard stopped 2 steps away from her. Not because he had been ordered to stop. Because every other person in the room had gone completely still, and the instinct to read a room before completing an action is, even in trained men, stronger than the original directive. The room was reading something it had no language for. The room produced no sound. Not a chair shifted. Not a glass moved. Not a breath was drawn that anyone was willing to acknowledge. Quan Sio, who had been facing the scroll, turned. He did not turn quickly. He turned the way a man turns when he has already decided, in the moment before the movement, that he will not allow whatever he sees to change his face. He had been making that decision his entire adult life. It had never once failed him. He looked at Adiz. She looked back at him. Brush in hand. Posture unchanged. As if she had been waiting for him to turn, not for 30 seconds, but for considerably longer than that. As if this specific moment was the destination and everything before it had been the road. She was holding the most sacred object in the room. The brush that represented, to every man seated at that table, the living hand of John Munho himself. The brush that sat in its holder between one anniversary and the next, untouched, unquestioned, a symbol of origin and authority and the particular kind of permanence that dynasties require to sustain themselves. A young woman in a server's uniform was holding it. And her posture communicated, clearly, without a word, that she had expected to be holding it. That this moment had not surprised her. That she had arrived at it precisely on time, on a schedule that no one else in this room had been permitted to see. Quan Sio's eyes moved once. To Park Dae-young. Park Dae-young was looking at the table. Quan Sio took 1 step toward her. Not fast. Not aggressive. One measured, deliberate step, the kind that costs something to take, because it is the step that commits a man to a conversation he has not yet decided he wants. He spoke in Korean. He asked her how she knew that character. The room waited. Some of the men at the table, later, would say they had assumed the question was rhetorical. That they had expected silence. Or fear. Or the fumbling apology of someone who had reached for something they did not understand. She answered him. In Korean. Without hesitation. Without a single inflection error. With a fluency that placed her origin somewhere this room had never once considered looking, somewhere between Lagos and Seoul, between a calligrapher's studio and a decision made 30 years ago by a man these 12 men had gathered tonight to honor. The guard who had stopped 2 steps away from her took 1 step back. No one in the room moved. 12 men had spent their careers learning when to act and when to wait. Every instinct they possessed told them to wait, because the man at the head of the table had not yet communicated what this was. Quan Sio turned once toward the guards. He made a single gesture, 2 fingers, barely elevated. Not a signal to advance. An instruction to withdraw. The guards left. The door closed. The room understood without being told that what followed was not a matter of security. It was something private. Something that required fewer witnesses, not more. Quan Sio looked at the empty chair to his left, the seat of a lieutenant who had stepped out earlier, and then he looked at Adiz. He pulled the chair out. Not a service chair along the wall. Not a stool from the periphery. A position at the table itself. His table. The one his father's legacy had furnished and his authority had maintained. The room received the invitation the way a room receives a fracture, in absolute stillness, in the suspended moment before something that has held for a very long time stops holding. Not one man at the table spoke. Not one man knew how to. Adiz sat without hesitation. That absence of hesitation communicated more than any answer she could have provided. A woman who sits at a table like that, in a room like this, without pausing to read the faces around her, without recalculating, is a woman who rehearsed this moment. Who arrived at it as a destination rather than an accident. Quan Sio returned to his seat. He removed his jacket and laid it across the back of his chair with deliberate care. His lieutenants had never seen that gesture. Not once. In this room, the jacket was armor. Removing it said something the men around the table had no existing language for. Park Dae-jung cleared his throat. It was a measured sound, controlled, avuncular, the practiced register of a man who had been redirecting dangerous conversations for 30 years. He raised a procedural item. A business matter deferred from earlier in the evening. Something requiring the room's attention before the night extended itself further. Kwon Seo said one word. It was not loud. It carried no heat. But it stopped Park Dae-jung mid-sentence with the precision of a hand placed flat against a chest, the kind of interruption that communicates not anger but something considerably more final. Park Dae-jung sat back. And did not attempt to speak again. Not yet. Adiz reached into her uniform. The movement was slow, visible, deliberate, a woman performing an action she needed the room to observe without flinching. She removed a small photograph. Black and white. Aged at the corners, the surface worn from years of handling by hands that understood what it represented. She placed it on the table. Two men. A calligraphy table between them. One Korean, one African, both with brushes, both leaning over what was unmistakably the scroll hanging on this wall for 30 years. Every eye in the room moved from Adiz to the photograph. And then, involuntarily, to the scroll. The reaction was not uniform. Lieutenant Cha Byung-ho's hand moved beneath the table. His eyes did not leave Adiz. He was already deciding how this ended, and his conclusion had nothing to do with the contents of the photograph. Nam Soo-jin lifted it by one corner, carefully, analytically, and studied it the way a man examines a document whose existence represents a structural liability requiring an immediate calculation of containment cost. Kwon Ji-woo did neither. He looked at Kwon Seo's face. He was the only person in the room asking the more consequential question. Kwon Seo held the photograph without urgency. He turned it once. Returned it to its original position. His eyes moved across it with the deliberate attention of a man examining something he cannot dismiss with confidence, and cannot afford to accept without one. Then he set it down. He looked at the scroll. Then at Adiz. He asked her, quietly, without preamble, to explain the specific brushwork visible in the founding seal. The stroke technique. Its origin. In precise detail. She described the technique by referencing a West African calligraphic tradition, a system of weighted brushwork that predated the scroll's recorded creation date by 2 full generations. She identified the pressure variation embedded in the seal's final stroke. She noted the specific entry angle of the enso, a detail imperceptible to anyone not trained in that tradition from the beginning. She spoke with the precision of someone educated. Not informed. Educated. The room absorbed this in silence. The scroll had not moved from the wall. But it was no longer the same object it had been 12 minutes ago. The room could feel that, even the men who did not yet understand why. Park Dae-jung spoke. His tone was measured, not dismissive, not hostile, but assembled with the careful architecture of a man deploying a position he had prepared for a long time. The African man in the photograph, he explained, had been an apprentice. Present during the creation. Contributing in the way apprentices contribute to the work of greater men. But the scroll was John Mun-ho's. It had always been John Mun-ho's work. That was not a contested matter. That was history. Adiz did not argue. She reached into her uniform a second time and placed a folded letter on the table. Visibly aged. Handwritten. Korean characters on the left half. Igbo on the right. Kwon Seo's hand moved toward the letter. Park Dae-jung's hand covered it first. The movement was faster than anything Park Dae-jung had done all evening, and the room registered it with the particular understanding that a man who moves that quickly to prevent something from being read is a man who already knows precisely what it says. Adiz looked at his hand on the letter. She stated, without inflection, that she had already read it. That the copy on this table was the third of 4 that her grandfather had prepared 30 years ago. And that her grandfather had not simply worked alongside John Mun-ho. He had taught him. Kwon Seo lifted Park Dae-young's hand from the letter. And opened it himself. Park Dae-young placed his hand on that letter before the most dangerous man in the room could reach it. Consider what that hand placement communicates. Consider how long he has been waiting, for precisely this occasion, this room, this moment, to make exactly that movement. He did not do it out of loyalty. He did it out of survival. And you recognized it the moment it happened. Silence right now, no subscription, no comment, no reaction, is not neutrality. It is a choice. And this story has just spent 12 minutes showing you with exact precision what that choice costs the people who make it quietly and consistently over 30 years. The people who understand what just happened at that table, subscribe. The people who cannot, go to the comments and tell us what is stopping you. Because disappearing without a word after that letter was uncovered is the most accurate statement you can make about where you stand. And this story has been about exactly that kind of statement from the beginning. Kwon Seo read the letter in full. He did not read quickly. He read the way a man reads something he is hoping to find a reason to disbelieve, moving through each sentence in search of the flaw that would release him from its weight. He did not find one. The room watched his face with the trained focus of men who had spent careers extracting information from that expression. They watched it for the full length of time it took him to read 2 handwritten pages in 2 languages. His face did not change. For the men who knew him, that was not composure. It was the most alarming response available to him. The letter was not an accusation. He turned it face up at the center of the table without speaking. It was an agreement. Co-authorship, signed in both men's hands and both languages, formally establishing John Mun-ho and Chukwemeka Obi as equal creators of the scroll, and equal co-founders of whatever legacy that scroll was used to consecrate. Both signatures. Both dates. Both seals pressed into the paper before the ink of the final character had dried. The scroll had 2 fathers. It had only ever claimed one. The agreement contained one clause. A single condition, written into the document before either man lifted his brush to sign. Not as formality. As covenant. That public acknowledgement of the co-founding was not optional. It was obligatory. A prerequisite of the scroll's moral authority, agreed upon by both men as the price of the thing they were building together. The acknowledgement was never made. For 30 years, the dynasty had operated on one half of a 2-name foundation. The scroll had been authorizing that incompleteness every time these 12 men gathered beneath it and called it truth. The agreement carried no legal weight in the present. Every man in the room understood that. The document was 3 decades old, predating entities and jurisdictions that no longer existed in their original form. A court would set it aside. A lawyer would find 6 ways to bury it before lunch. But this was not a courtroom. This was the room where the dynasty's annual ceremony had just been interrupted by evidence that the ceremony was incomplete. That the founding was not what it had always been presented as. That the scroll was not the object any of them had been told it was. The moral weight was absolute. And in this room, tonight, that was the only weight that mattered. Kwon Seo set the letter down. Then he was silent. Not the silence of a man collecting himself. The silence of a man who has arrived, unexpectedly, at a question he spent his entire life not needing to ask, and is standing at its edge, understanding that it was always there. He spoke once. Not to the room. To himself. A single question about his father, quiet, without guard, the kind of private thought that surfaces only when a man forgets, for one unprotected moment, that he is not alone. The men at the table looked away. Not in disrespect. Because they were witnessing something they were never supposed to see. Park Dae-young opened his mouth. A sentence began, measured, practiced, the familiar architecture of a man who had always known what to say when a dangerous room needed managing. It did not complete itself. For the first time in 30 years, in this specific room, the sentence did not come. Adiz spoke into the silence that followed. She stated, without raising her voice, that her grandfather had not accepted erasure without response. In the final decade of his life, EKA Obi had contacted the John family through legitimate channels, dated letters, formal correspondence, legal intermediaries. Every attempt documented. Every attempt traceable. Not one had reached John Mun Ho. Every one had been intercepted. Not by Kwon Seo. By the man seated to his right. The room shifted. Not physically. The shift was in the quality of the silence, the difference between men waiting to understand something, and men who have understood it and are now deciding what that understanding costs them personally. Adiz let it settle. She was not simply EKA Obi's granddaughter acting on grief. She was a trained legal documentation specialist. 8 years of professional work had gone into building the evidentiary chain her grandfather could not complete before his death. He did not raise his voice. He stated directly, with the economy of a man who had moved past the point of diplomatic framing, that Adiz should be removed from the building. The room waited for Kwon Seo. Kwon Seo said nothing. He did not look at Cha Byung-ho. He did not look at Adiz. He looked at a fixed point on the table, and the silence that followed held long enough, and firmly enough, that it stopped being silence entirely and became, without ambiguity, a refusal. Cha Byung-ho sat back down. Adiz did not react. She had not expected anything different. She had not been afraid of any version of how this evening could end. The room was only beginning to understand that. Park Dae-young rose from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, the unhurriedness of a man who understood that how he stood in this moment would communicate as much as what he said in it. He straightened his jacket with concentrated care. One lapel, then the other. 3 additional seconds. Purchased. He told Kwon Seo that there were things about the night EKA Obi was turned away that Kwon Seo had never been told. Things that could not be permitted to remain in this room if they were spoken aloud. The room understood what had just happened before Kwon Seo did. Park Dae-young had not addressed the most powerful man present. He had addressed the only person in the room he could not predict. The only person in the room who had arrived carrying something he could not contain, and who had made clear, without saying it directly, that the containment was no longer in his hands. He had not warned Kwon Seo. He had asked Adiz. And she had not answered him. She looked at Park Dae-young the way a person looks at a door that has just been revealed to have always been unlocked, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with the quiet recognition of someone who built the key a long time ago and has simply been waiting for the right room. The man who has served that family for 30 years just looked at a young woman and told the most powerful person in the room that there are things that cannot leave this building. You felt what that sentence was. Something in you registered, with precise accuracy, what it was not. It was not a warning to Kwon Seo. It was a request directed at the only person in the room he cannot control. Now ask yourself honestly, what kind of person sits quietly after recognizing something that specific, and does nothing at all with it? The people who read that sentence correctly, subscribe. This channel is built for people who understand rooms, not merely scenes. And if something is genuinely preventing you from subscribing, go to the comments and explain it. Because silence after that particular moment is not a passive position. It is the specific choice Park Dae-young has been making every day for 30 years. And you have just watched, in unsparing detail, exactly where that road terminates. The room had not moved. But it had divided. Some men were watching Kwon Seo, reading his stillness for the instruction that had not yet arrived. Some were watching Park Dae-young, measuring the distance between what he had said and what he had not. And Kwon Ji-woo, from his position near the far end of the table, had not looked at either of them. He was watching Adiz. Kwon Seo turned to Park Dae-young. No heat. No volume. The precise directness of a man who has decided that the only remaining option is the question itself. He asked Park Dae-young to describe what happened the night EKA Obi came to the John compound. Park Dae-young did not hesitate. That was the first unexpected thing. He gave his account without visible defense, without the practiced warmth, without the architecture of management. He simply described it. EKA Obi had not arrived merely to request acknowledgement. He had come with the original signed agreement, a notarized witness, and a journalist. All three present. All three prepared. Park Dae-young had removed all three before John Mun-ho ever knew they were at the compound. The documentation was suppressed. The incident sealed. John Mun-ho had gone to his death unaware that any of it had occurred. The room absorbed this in a silence unlike any that had come before it. John Mun-ho had not broken the agreement. He had never known it was being tested. The betrayal was not his, it belonged entirely to the man who had stood closest to him, who had made a decision that the dynasty required a protection its founder would never have authorized, at the cost of erasing a man's life's work and silencing a legitimate claim. 30 years of ceremony beneath a scroll. And the man the dynasty had been built to honor had been, in the private truth of his own signed agreement, honorable. Kwon Seo did not speak. The men around the table could read, in his stillness, the specific weight of what had landed. This was not a political problem. Not a strategic one. It was something older, the discovery that the man he had organized his entire judgment around had committed the one act his father would never have sanctioned. Kwon Seo had built himself on that man's counsel. Had become, in many ways, the version of himself that 30 years of that counsel had shaped. The identity he had constructed, the one that required him to be the keeper of his father's integrity, had just developed a fracture it could not close. Park Dae-young's posture changed. The tension that had held his shoulders since Adiz picked up the brush released by a visible degree. He had spoken the truth on his own terms, at a moment of his choosing. In his understanding, that still constituted control. He began to speak about resolution. Measured, considered. The documentation could be managed through appropriate legal channels. Adiz could be compensated privately, the matter handled with discretion. The scroll's history could be corrected in private records, quietly, without disruption to the dynasty's standing. He presented it like an offer. Like a man who had just survived something and was now negotiating the terms of survival. Adiz let him finish. Then she told the room that the third-party release had already been activated. Not because a deadline had passed. Because it had been built specifically to trigger the moment a particular phrase was spoken aloud in this room, a phrase confirming that the suppression was real, acknowledged, and on record. Park Dae-young had used that phrase in his confession. He had not been asked to. He had chosen it freely, delivered it on his own terms, in what he had believed was a controlled environment. His words had served as the activation. The resolution he was outlining was no longer available to anyone in this room. Adiz had not been the architect. She had been the instrument. The final, necessary, human element in a structure her grandfather had built across 30 years, timed to this ceremony, this anniversary, this exact room. EKA Obi had chosen the date of his own exclusion as the date of its completion. He had built something that did not require him to survive it. That could complete itself through the right person, in the right room, at the right moment. The documentation was now in the possession of 3 separate legal and journalistic entities. Simultaneously. Irreversibly. There was nothing left to contain. Kwon Seo asked one question. Not about the dynasty. Not about the journalists or the documentation or the 3 entities now reading 30 years of suppressed history. He asked only whether his father had known. Park Dae-young held eye contact for a moment. Then his gaze lowered. The silence that followed extended long enough to remove every possible interpretation except one. It was not a denial withheld. It was not hesitation. It was a confession delivered without words, the only kind Park Dae-young had left. John Mun-ho had not known. His most trusted man had made that decision alone, for 30 years, in his name. Kwon Ji-woo crossed the room to Adiz. No threat. No diplomatic management. A direct question, Had any of this been personal for her? She considered it. Then she told him it had never been personal. It had always been architectural. Her grandfather built something that required one specific person to enter one specific room and be present at its completion. The decision had been made 30 years ago by a man who trusted that the right person would be standing there when it mattered. She had been prepared. That was all. Quan Ji Wu absorbed this. Then he asked about the 2-second pause, her first look at the scroll, early in the evening. She told him it was not recognition. It was verification. She was confirming the scroll was the original before allowing the evening to proceed. She had needed to be certain. 11 minutes had passed since Quan Sio last moved. The men around him had been watching something they had no category for, the man their own certainties were built upon, rebuilding himself in plain sight, without tools, without assistance, in the specific silence of someone who has discovered that the foundation was real but the architecture around it belonged to someone else. Then he stood. He crossed the room to the wall. He lifted the scroll from its hanging with both hands, and stood holding it. The room waited. He turned to Adiz. And he asked her the one question that would determine everything that followed. You have remained through every shift this room has produced. You were present when the confession was made, when the false resolution collapsed, when a 30-year architecture designed by a man who died before seeing it complete triggered itself in a sealed room in Lagos. You watched a man remove the most sacred object in his world from the wall and stand holding it like a question he has carried his entire life without knowing it had a name. Leaving now, without a word, without a reaction, without a trace, is the most self-revealing act available to you at this moment. The people who are still here because they need to know what that question is, subscribe. What he asks in the next act defines everything this story has constructed, and the people who are not present will not hear it. And if something is holding you back from subscribing, go to the comments now and name it precisely. Because silence after this particular moment is not rest. It is the choice Park Dae-young made every morning for 30 years. And you have just watched, in exact and unsparing detail, where that road ends. He still held the scroll. Both hands. Not the way a man holds a weapon or a document or a proof of ownership. The way a man holds something whose full weight he is only now correctly calculating, because he has spent his entire life carrying it at the wrong angle. He looked at Adiz. The question he asked was not about the dynasty. Not about the journalists, not about the men who had just left the room, not about the infrastructure that would spend the next several weeks recalibrating itself around what had occurred tonight. He asked what her grandfather had actually wanted. From this room. On this night. The final destination of everything he had built. She did not answer immediately. When she spoke, she described EKA Obi's final recorded words. Not an accusation. Not a demand for compensation. Not the language of a man who had spent 30 years building toward destruction. He had wanted the scroll to be correct. Not replaced. Not destroyed. Corrected. A second name added to its founding seal, in the calligraphic tradition of both its makers, so that what the scroll had always claimed to be, it could finally, without qualification, actually become. Nothing architecturally more. Nothing less. Quan Sio looked at the scroll in his hands for a long moment. Then he looked at the ceremonial brush on the side table, the same one Adiz had lifted at the start of the evening, the same one sitting untouched between one anniversary and the next. He looked at her. And he asked her to show him how the correction was made. The room, which had been holding something close to held breath for the better part of an hour, shifted into a stillness entirely different from everything that had preceded it. Not the stillness of men waiting for a consequence. The stillness of men witnessing something they had not expected to be permitted to see. She stood. She lifted the brush, the same grip, the same wrist position, the hold of someone trained across years rather than hours. She worked without hesitation. The correction was precise. The second name placed beside the first in the stroke tradition her grandfather had taught her, the weighted brushwork of a West African calligraphic lineage 2 generations older than the scroll itself. The kind of mark that could only be made by someone who had been shown how. The red enso remained. But it now enclosed both names. Both hands. Both inheritances. The scroll had become, at last, what the two men who created it had agreed it should always be. When she stepped back, Quan Sio returned the scroll to the wall himself. He hung it without ceremony. Then he turned to the room and spoke once, directly, without theater, without elevation of volume. Park Dae-young's position within the dynasty was ended. No elaboration. No confrontation extended beyond what had already occurred. One sentence, direct eye contact held for the precise duration required, and then a single look toward Quan Ji-woo, who stood and opened the door without needing to be asked twice. The room understood what the open door meant. It was not a request. Park Dae-young rose. He straightened his jacket, one lapel, then the other, with the same deliberate care as before. But the seconds it purchased led nowhere new. There was no decision left to arrive at. Only the walk. He moved toward the door without looking back. Without addressing the room. Without addressing the scroll he had protected and curated and weaponized for 30 years. The door closed behind him. And the dynasty he had spent his life constructing now knew, completely, what he had built it on, and what he had chosen to bury inside the foundation so that no one would find it until he had decided they could. The men remaining at the table did not speak. They did not need to. Each of them understood, without being instructed, what the correction to that seal meant for the infrastructure they operated within. The Lagos corridor, every arrangement, every relationship, every agreement that had derived its authority from the scroll's cultural legitimacy in this region, now rested on a foundation that acknowledged an African co-authorship. The ground had changed. Not in a way requiring immediate action. In a way that each man in the room would spend considerable time, privately, carefully, deciding what to do with. The room emptied gradually. Men left the way men leave after something consequential, with the care of people who understand that how they exit is itself a statement. When the last of them had gone, Quan Sio and Adiz stood at the table. Not allies. Not adversaries. Not two people at the close of a negotiation. Something more precise and harder to categorize, two people at the completion of something neither had initiated and neither fully owned. Quan Sio did not ask about her training. Her 8 years of construction. The deliberate positioning that had placed her in this building 11 months ago. He left it unaddressed. In the language of this room, that was the most complete acknowledgement he had. The smell of ink had never been accidental. Adiz had been in this room before the guests arrived. She had placed the brush within reach of the exact position she had calculated she would occupy when the moment came. She had confirmed the scroll was the original. She had allowed the evening to proceed. Every element had been constructed. But one thing remained open, mentioned early, without emphasis, and never returned to. 4 copies of the agreement. 3 had served their purpose tonight. The 3rd had triggered a release. The 2nd had been read at this table. The 1st had arrived with EKA OB 30 years ago and been suppressed. The 4th had existed somewhere for 3 decades. Someone had been holding it. And they had not moved. Not yet. When Adiz left, Quan Sio remained. He stood in the empty room, the lantern still burning, the table returned to its formal arrangement, the chairs precisely placed as though 12 men had gathered, performed a ceremony, and departed without the floor shifting beneath everything they understood. On the wall, the corrected scroll. On the table below it, 2 brushes. One old. One new. Both resting. The most powerful act of the entire evening had not been the confrontation, the confession, or the correction itself. It had been an old man in Lagos, 30 years ago, deciding to build something that could complete itself without him, and trusting, with everything he had left, that the right person would be standing in the right room when it was time. He had been correct. Before you leave tonight, drop your city, your state, or your country in the comments. I want to know precisely how far this story traveled. And I want one more thing from you. Tell me whether Quan Seo made the right decision. Did he honor his father, or did he fracture his dynasty? Leave your answer below. Honor, or dynasty. And if you want to know where the fourth copy of that agreement has been for 30 years, and whose hands have been protecting it, subscribe before the next chapter begins. That story is already in motion. It will not pause for anyone who is not in the room.